Hello there, and welcome to my channel, World of the Lost. I'm Linda Simmons, and I live on a small, foggy island on the east coast of Canada. And like most places along the coast, we've got more stories than we know what to do with. We've got stories of shipwrecks, disappearances, strange names on maps, things that make you stop and say, "Now I wonder what happened there." I love digging into these old stories and the old mysteries. So if you enjoy intriguing stories with a bit of salt air on them, I think you'll feel right at home here. Today, let's talk about Murder Island. You know, it seems like every place around here has a story. Some are funny, some are sad, some just sit there waiting to be told. And Murder Island is one of those. It's out among the Tuscan Islands, and there's a low, weather-worn piece of rock and grass. It's nothing special to look at. If you passed by it in your boat, you might not even think twice. But its old French name is said to have been Ile à Massacre, and over time that became anglicized to Murder Island. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that's the kind of name you just casually give a place. So the question is, what happened? Before we get to the earliest story of how the island got its name, let's talk about the Acadians. The Acadians were early French settlers who arrived around 1650. They were farming, fishing, building dikes in the marshlands. They lived quietly between empires that traded Nova Scotia back and forth like it was a piece on a game board. The British took Nova Scotia in 1710, and then they decided they wanted full loyalty from everyone living in Nova Scotia. And that began in 1755 with the expulsion of the Acadians. The Acadian people were rounded up like animals. Their families were separated and they were shipped out. Their farms and their villages were burned so they could not return. Which brings us to our first story of how Murder Island got its name. It's told through oral tradition that the island was first named Ile à Massacre by the Acadians because they had found human skeletal remains on the island, and that the bones showed that the deaths had been violent. That places the name of the island somewhere between 1650 and 1755. The name was originally French and then anglicized to Murder Island after the expulsion of the Acadians. We'll never know if that's a true story of how Murder Island got its name, because there are other stories about this island as well. So back to the expulsion of the Acadians story. Not all communities were swept up at the same time, and some French families got wind of what was happening, so some ran. Some hid deeper in the woods. Some took shelter with their friendly Indigenous neighbors. On the mainland around Murder Island, it's said that some tried to escape inland along the Tuscan River and up into the lakes. There are stories of pursuit by the British, of ambushes, of men killed at narrow stretches of water. Now, as far as we know, none of that happened on Murder Island. Those stories are upriver, but the region was tense and the times were violent. Some have suggested that the bones on Murder Island belong to the victims of that era, that perhaps if the victims didn't die there, their bodies were carried there on purpose, left without burial as a final and deliberate act of cruelty. It wouldn't have been out of character for the times. They were hard years, and mercy was in short supply. The British removal was not gentle. It was brutal. Families were torn apart, homes were burned, entire communities were set ablaze. But ask yourself this: would soldiers in the middle of that campaign have taken the time to carry bodies out to an island, to transport them across water, rather than just leave them where they fell? It's possible, but if we're being honest, it doesn't seem very likely. So there's another story. About 20 years before the expulsion of the Acadians, in December of 1735, a brigantine called Baltimore arrived in the bay. Just a wooden brigantine, 2 masts, some canvas, some rope, the sort of ship that carried cargo, and sometimes it carried more human misery than any ship is built to hold. So she had sailed from Ireland that autumn. On board were passengers. They're believed to have been convicts being transported to the colonies. Transportation of convicts to the colonies was common in those days. Britain emptied its overcrowded prisons by sending men and women across the Atlantic. The voyage itself was long and harsh. Space was tight, air was stale, food was probably half rotten, and tempers under those conditions were likely very short. And somewhere during that crossing by Baltimore, something happened. Official correspondence from Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, Lawrence Armstrong, speaks of mutiny, of the owner, the captain, and members of the crew being killed during a violent uprising at sea. The story goes that by the time Baltimore reached waters of Chebogue, which is not far from Murder Island, the command structure of the ship had totally collapsed, and she was brought into an isolated harbor along the coast. So one day, there she was, sitting there, quietly at anchor, near what is now called Chebogue. Under investigation, it was found that there was no one aboard, except for a single woman found cowering in the captain's quarters. The deck showed blood and signs of struggle. Where was the crew? And who was the woman? She presented herself as Mrs. Buckler, the ship owner's wife. She told authorities that the crew and the passengers had perished from hardship, and that she alone had survived extraordinary suffering. But there were doubts. The French governor at Louisbourg questioned her story outright. He suggested she may not be who she claimed to be, that perhaps she knew far more about what was happening aboard the Baltimore than she was saying. And then, another twist. A letter arrived from the real Mrs. Buckler, very much alive and somewhere else entirely, inquiring as to the fate of her husband and his ship, which meant the woman from the Baltimore had assumed a false name. But by this time, the fake Mrs. Buckler had been put on a ship to Boston. Then she just disappears from the official record. In the meantime, bodies were reportedly found along the Tuscan Islands. Not 1 or 2, but enough to alarm officials. Did any of whatever happened on the Baltimore take place on Murder Island? The island is not far from where the ship sat at anchor. So could the bones the Acadians found have been due to events related to that ship? We don't know. What we do know is this: Baltimore was investigated. Letters went back and forth between colonial officials. The incident was known. It was discussed, it was argued over, and it was not a forgotten event. And if bodies were washing up along these islands in 1735, the memory of that ship would have been fresh. So here's the question. If bones were found later on Murder Island, wouldn't somebody have just simply said, "Oh, those must be from the Baltimore"? unless the bones were discovered before 1735 or long after 1735, when living memory had dimmed and the story had kind of blurred. Were the remains on Murder Island victims of mutiny aboard the Baltimore? It's possible, but the story doesn't lock neatly into place either. And that's where our mystery widens yet again. Because there's another explanation. That it was a skirmish involving Indigenous people and Europeans. You see this suggested in some 1800s writing, often when details were scarce and assumptions filled the gaps. The Mi'kmaq were here long before anyone else. They knew this land in ways newcomers could not. And when the Acadians arrived, the Mi'kmaq were not their enemies. They lived alongside them, they traded with them, and taught them how to survive in a climate and a landscape that could be unforgiving. That relationship was, by most accounts, cooperative and respectful. And we also have to remember, in earlier centuries and even today, it was easy to lay unexplained violence at the feet of Indigenous people. Long before the word racism was ever used, the habit of suspicion was already there. So while not every encounter was written down, and we can't dismiss every possibility outright, there's no clear event tied to Murder Island. It feels less like a preserved memory and more like a convenient explanation offered when no one had any better answers. And then there's Oak Island. If you're not familiar with Oak Island, it's a small island in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, a little over 100 miles from Murder Island. For over 200 years, people have been digging there in search of what's believed to be a hidden treasure. Sometimes it's called the Money Pit. The legend says that in the late 1700s, a group of young men discovered a strange depression in the ground and began to dig. They found layers of logs at regular intervals, as if someone had engineered something deep beneath the earth. Since then, generations of people have searched for what might be buried there. It could be pirate treasure, Spanish gold, artifacts linked to the Knights Templar, or even Shakespeare's lost manuscripts. It's become one of the most famous unsolved treasure hunts in the world. And like most long-running mysteries, it has gathered its share of theories. One of those theories suggests that enslaved people were brought to the New World to construct elaborate underground workings on Oak Island to hide what must have been something extremely valuable. And then they were killed to protect the secret, either on Murder Island or dumped on Murder Island. That idea has drifted through local lore and popular imagination. You'll even find it on Wikipedia. But there is no solid documentation tying such an event to Murder Island, or even to Oak Island. Still, when bones are found, and when names like massacre and murder attach themselves to places, people begin connecting the dots. Sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes wildly. So here we are, with an island, a name that suggests a massacre happened here, and 4 possibilities. A mutiny on the Baltimore, violence during the expulsion of the Acadians, an older skirmish, or modern-day treasure hunting. And none of them fit perfectly. Maybe the truth is one of these, maybe it's 2 stories overlapping, or maybe it's something simpler. Maybe it was just a ship. We all know how disease moved through wooden vessels in the age of sail. Smallpox, fever, scurvy, entire crews weakened in a matter of weeks or even days. If a ship put in near shore with bodies, or if there was a wreck that left the dead to be dealt with quickly, burial might not have been ceremonial. It might just have been hurried and practical. And over time, bones become stories? I don't know the answer to this mystery, and I'm not pretending that I do, but the name remains, and names usually have a reason. So here's my call to action for you. Let me know in the comments if you're from this area and you've heard something different, or if you'd like to share which of these stories makes the most sense to you. I'd love to hear it. Because around here, history doesn't just live in archives. It lives in community and in memories and in stories. So if you enjoyed this little story and want to keep exploring these mysteries with me, I'd appreciate it if you would tap the like icon and feel free to subscribe. There are lots more stories waiting along this coast, and I'd love to share them with you. Until next time, stay curious.